The sun was a hammer, and the dust of the trail was the anvil. Boone Delaney felt himself being forged into something brittle and mean between them. His sweat had carved clean paths through the grime on his face, and his shirt, a dark, damp map of his misery, clung to his skin. It was the kind of heat that baked the charity right out of a man's soul, leaving only the hardpan of impatience. But Boone's patience had been exhausted hours ago. All that remained was a simmering, helpless rage directed at the one creature on earth he usually trusted more than any human, his mule. Copper stood planted, a statue of dusty brown defiance, 4 hooves seemingly nailed to the hard-packed earth at the mouth of the bridge. Her long ears, which normally swiveled with an almost scientific curiosity, were pinned back flat against her skull. Her eyes, usually a soft, intelligent brown, were wide with a stark, white-rimmed terror. A low, vibrating hum came from deep in her chest, a sound Boone had heard only once before, when a mountain lion had stalked their camp in the high country. She was not being stubborn, she was petrified. The bridge was the problem. It was always the bridge. A skeletal spine of sun-bleached timber and rusted iron bolts, it spanned the deep, shadowed gash of Whisper Canyon. The townsfolk of Redemption called it the crossing, but to Boone, it had always looked more like a dare. It groaned when the wind blew hard, a low, mournful sound that echoed up from the gorge below, and its planks rattled like old teeth with every passing wagon. Most animals hesitated before it, their instincts wary of the hollow sound and the dizzying drop. But this was different. This was not caution. This was an absolute, soul-deep refusal. Copper's body was a single rigid muscle of no. "Come on now, girl," Boone muttered, his voice a low rasp. He gave the lead rope a gentle tug. Copper didn't budge. She dug in, her muscles bunching, her breath coming in short, panicked snorts that fogged the hot air. He tried again, a harder pull this time, leaning his weight into it. The rope went taut, humming with the strain, but the mule might as well have been part of the geology. "Damn you, Copper. It's a bridge. We've crossed 100 of them." His voice was swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Behind them, the trail snaked back towards the small cluster of buildings that was Redemption. Ahead, the bridge stretched over the chasm, a gateway to the open country where Boone had a contract to deliver supplies to a remote mining camp. He was already a day behind schedule. This delay was more than an inconvenience. It was money leaking out of his pocket with every passing second. The sound of laughter, thin and reedy on the hot wind, drifted up from the town. A few children had noticed the standoff and were pointing. Soon, a handful of adults wandered over to observe the spectacle. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Olson, with arms like wagon axles, leaned against the porch of the general store, a smirk on his face. Martha Gable, the town's chief purveyor of gossip, stood with her arms crossed, her sharp face alight with interest. "Having trouble there, Delaney?" Olson called out, his voice a booming counterpoint to the bridge's groan. Boone didn't answer. He set his jaw, his face burning with a frustration that was rapidly curdling into humiliation. He was Boone Delaney, the best damn mule skinner in the territory. His reputation was built on his ability to move stubborn animals over impossible terrain. To be bested by his own mule, in full view of the town, was a special kind of hell. He walked to Copper's head, stroking her neck. The fur was damp and trembling. He could feel the frantic thumping of her heart against his palm. "Easy, girl. It's just wood and air," he murmured, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. He looked into her eyes and saw not obstinacy, but a raw, primordial fear that chilled him despite the oppressive heat. What did she see that he couldn't? What did she smell on the wind that his dull human senses missed? He looked again at the bridge. It seemed to shimmer in the heat, its lines wavering. The shadows beneath it, in the deep gut of the canyon, were unnaturally dark, a black so profound it felt like a physical presence, a void that was actively pulling the light into itself. The wind whistled through the gorge, and for a moment, the sound was not like wind at all, but like a long, drawn-out sigh of sorrow. "Maybe she's just smarter than you, Boone," someone shouted from the growing crowd. More laughter followed. The mockery was a spur. Gritting his teeth, Boone grabbed Copper's halter, determined to drag her across by sheer force. "You're moving, you stubborn sack of bones, if I have to pull your ears off," he snarled, throwing his entire weight and will into the effort. Copper responded not with resistance, but with pure, unadulterated panic. She reared back, pulling the rope from his hand with a sharp snap that sent a jolt up his arm. Her front hooves pawed at the air, her silhouette stark against the pale, bleached sky. And then she let out a cry. It wasn't the usual bray of a mule. It was a sound torn from the deepest part of her, a horrifying, high-pitched scream of mourning and terror that echoed across the canyon. It was a sound of absolute grief, of a creature bearing witness to a horror it could not name. The laughter from the town died instantly. The smirks vanished. The crowd, which had been a loose collection of curious onlookers, drew together, a sudden shared unease rippling through them. The children stopped pointing and huddled closer to their parents. Olson, the blacksmith, straightened up, his jovial expression replaced by a wary frown. Even Martha Gable looked unsettled. Boone Delaney's mule was not being difficult. Boone Delaney's mule was screaming, as if she were seeing a ghost. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. It was broken only by Copper's ragged, wheezing breaths and the lonely, perpetual groaning of the bridge. The standoff was no longer a personal embarrassment for Boone. It had become a public spectacle of a different kind, a disturbing and inexplicable event that held the entire town in its thrall. The bridge no longer looked like a simple crossing. It felt like a threshold, a barrier between the known world and something dreadful that waited in the shadows below. The wind blew again, carrying that same sorrowful whisper up from the depths, and this time, everyone heard it. Marshal Wade's arrival was a subtle shift in the landscape's gravity. He didn't hurry, his long-legged stride eating up the distance from his office with an economy of motion that suggested a man who never wasted energy. He was tall and lean, his face weathered not by sun and wind alone, but by the constant low-grade burden of seeing the worst in men and hoping for the best. A perceptive lawman, he dealt less in gunsmoke and more in the quiet, unyielding pressure of his presence. As he approached the knot of silent townspeople, they parted for him, their collective gaze shifting from the terrified mule to him, as if his badge alone could offer an explanation for the unnatural scene. "Boone," he said, his voice calm and level. It wasn't a question, just an acknowledgement. He came to a stop a few feet away, his eyes taking in the entire tableau. Boone's stance, a mixture of fury and helplessness, the crowd's tense silence, and most of all, the mule. He looked at Copper for a long moment, noting the flared nostrils, the sweat-darkened coat, the trembling that shook her powerful frame. "She won't cross, Marshal," Boone said, the words clipped. "Never seen anything like it. It's like the devil himself is squatting on that bridge." Wade didn't smile at the description. He walked past Boone and approached the head of the bridge himself. He placed a boot on the first plank, testing its weight. The wood creaked, a familiar sound, yet now it seemed sinister. He squinted, peering into the chasm below. The shadows were deep, a stark contrast to the brilliant, unforgiving sunlight. From this vantage point, the bottom of the gorge was a chaotic jumble of rock and hardy, twisted scrub brush. Nothing looked out of the ordinary, yet the feeling of wrongness was palpable. It was in the air, a low hum of dissonance that set one's teeth on edge. "She's a good animal, your Copper," Wade said, turning back to Boone. "Not prone to hysterics." "Best mule I ever owned," Boone affirmed, his voice tight. "She saved my life twice. Once from a rattler I never saw, once from a flash flood up on the Cimarron. She feels things, and whatever she's feeling right now—" Boone trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the mule, who had now lowered her head, her breath still coming in shaky gusts. Doc Holloway, a man whose gentle hands and compassionate eyes had seen more suffering than anyone in redemption, stepped forward from the crowd. He was older, with a fringe of white hair and a face etched with the lines of worry, mostly for other people. "Marshal, I've seen horses get spooked by a snake on the trail, or the scent of a predator. This is different. The animal is in genuine distress. It's a physiological terror." Wade nodded, his gaze returning to the canyon. The collective unease of the town was a tangible thing now. It had seeped into him, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the day's heat. The mule's mournful cries had acted as a summons, a dire warning that could no longer be ignored. The personal problem of a mule skinner had become a town-wide concern, a shared premonition that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with the very ground they stood on. "Something down there is spooking her," Wade said, his voice low but carrying in the stillness. It wasn't a guess, it was a conclusion. He looked from the bridge to the crowd. "I'm going down." A murmur went through the assembled people. To descend into Whisper Canyon was no small feat. The walls were steep, nearly sheer in places, a treacherous mix of loose rock and unforgiving granite. "You'll need rope," Olson the blacksmith said immediately, his earlier mockery forgotten, replaced by a grim sense of purpose. "Good rope. I'll get the block and tackle from my shop. We can rig an anchor to my anvil." The suggestion galvanized the men. The spell of fearful inaction was broken, replaced by the need to do something, to confront the unseen source of this dread. A few men hurried off with Olson, their boots kicking up dust. Others began scanning the cliff top, looking for a secure point to anchor the ropes. The women started talking in low, worried tones, some instinctively pulling their children closer. Boone, feeling a strange mixture of relief and escalating fear, went to Copper's side. He didn't try to lead her anymore. He just stood with her, a hand on her neck, offering what little comfort he could. Her trembling had subsided into a continuous, low-frequency shudder. She kept her head lowered, aimed at the canyon, as if in a trance. Every few minutes, another of those low, keening cries would escape her, a sound that seemed to be pulled from the very roots of the earth. Each cry was a punctuation mark in the tense preparations, a constant auditory reminder of the unseen horror that awaited below. The men returned with heavy coils of rope, thick chains, and the massive, solid form of Olson's anvil. They worked with a quiet, focused intensity, their movements economical and sure. They drove iron stakes deep into the hard earth a safe distance from the canyon's edge and secured the anvil as a deadweight anchor. The block and tackle was rigged, its pulleys oiled and ready. The efficiency of their work was a testament to a life lived on the frontier, where survival often depended on practical skills and the ability to improvise. But this time, their work felt different. It felt less like a practical task and more like a ritual, a solemn preparation for a descent into an underworld. Wade stripped off his gun belt and hat, handing them to one of the men. He checked the knot on the rope that was tied around his waist, pulling it taut with a sharp jerk. He was all focus now, his face a mask of grim determination. He stood at the edge of the precipice, the rope trailing down into the impenetrable darkness below. "Keep the line taut, but let me control the descent," he instructed Olson, who took charge of the anchor point. "Boone, keep that mule quiet if you can. I need to be able to hear." Boone just nodded, his throat too dry for words. He watched as Wade took a deep breath, gave a final, sharp nod to Olson, and then stepped backwards off the edge of the world, disappearing into the shadows. The rope began to pay out, creaking softly through the pulley. The crowd surged forward, a single, silent body, their faces a mixture of awe and terror as they watched the line snake its way down into the void. All eyes were on the rope, their only connection to the man who had willingly entered the darkness they all feared. The only sounds were the groaning of the pulley, the whisper of the wind that seemed to be eternally sighing through the gorge, and Copper's intermittent, heartbreaking cries, which now served as a dire, echoing chorus to the unfolding drama. The sun beat down, but everyone felt cold. They were no longer just watching, they were waiting. And with every foot of rope that disappeared over the edge, the weight of that waiting grew heavier, more suffocating, a shared, silent prayer for what the marshal would or would not find in the dark heart of the canyon. Time stretched thin, measured in the rhythmic creak of the pulley and the slow scrape of Wade's boots against unseen rock. From the cliff top, the crowd could see nothing but the rope disappearing into the abyss. They were a congregation of upturned, anxious faces, bound by a shared, fearful suspense. Boone stood slightly apart, his hand resting on Copper's neck, feeling the persistent tremor that ran through her. He found himself listening with an intensity that bordered on pain, straining to hear any sound from below over the blood pounding in his own ears. The mule's occasional low moans were the only answer, a constant, sorrowful refrain. The silence from the gorge was more terrifying than any scream. It was a void of information, a vacuum that the mind rushed to fill with increasingly dreadful possibilities. A fall, a hidden beast, something worse. Then a voice, faint and distorted by the canyon's acoustics, echoed up. "Hello up there! I'm down!" A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. Olson, his hands wrapped tightly around the rope, shouted back, his voice booming. "We hear you, Marshal. You all right?" There was a pause, and then the muffled reply. "I'm fine. It's a mess down here. Boulders, washouts. Hard to see." The tension on the cliff top eased, but only slightly. He was alive, he was safe, but he hadn't found anything yet. The mystery remained. The men holding the rope relaxed their grips a fraction, and the women began to murmur amongst themselves. Boone, however, felt no relief. Copper hadn't calmed. If anything, her agitation seemed to grow, as if Wade's presence below had only stirred whatever specter haunted the place. They waited. The sun crept across the sky, shortening the shadows of the people on the cliff edge, but doing nothing to illuminate the permanent twilight at the bottom of the gorge. The minutes dragged on, each one a small eternity. Children grew restless and were shushed by their mothers. Men shifted their weight, their faces grim. The initial drama of the descent had faded, leaving behind the hard, tedious work of waiting for a discovery. Then Wade's voice came again, closer this time, and laced with something new. Not fear, but a strange, sharp note of discovery. "There's something over here, tangled in the brush." Every head craned forward. Olson yelled back, "What is it?" Another long pause. The silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. The wind died down completely, and in the sudden stillness Copper let out a soft, whimpering noise. "It's wood," Wade's voice echoed, clearer now. "Splintered. A lot of it. Looks like the axle of a wagon." A wagon. The word rippled through the crowd, a wreck. That was it. A simple accident. A trader who took the bridge too fast, a farmer whose horse bolted. It was a tragic but understandable explanation. A sense of mundane, sorrowful logic began to settle over the people. It was a relief, in a way. An accident had a cause and an effect. It wasn't a nameless, supernatural dread. "Can you see who it belonged to?" Boone found himself shouting, his own voice sounding raw and unfamiliar. The reply from below was slow in coming. They could hear the sounds of Wade moving around, the crackle of dry brush, the scrape of his boots on loose rock. The suspense, which had momentarily receded, came flooding back, stronger than before. They were on the precipice of an answer. "It's smashed to kindling," Wade called up. His voice had changed again. The note of discovery was gone, replaced by a somber, heavy tone. "Thrown a long way from the bridge. Must have happened a long time ago. Everything's rotted, buried in silt." He paused. "There's a wheel, half buried, and God Almighty." His voice cut off. The final two words were not a shout, but a choked exclamation, a prayer forced out by shock. The silence that followed was absolute. The crowd held its breath as one. The rope in Olson's hands went completely still. "Marshal!" Olson called, his voice tight with alarm. "Wade, what is it? What do you see?" The response was a long, terrible moment of nothing. The sun beat down. A fly buzzed past Boone's ear. He could feel his own heart hammering against his ribs. The world seemed to shrink to the single point of the rope disappearing over the cliff edge. And then, Wade's voice rose from the depths, hollow and stripped of all authority, leaving only the raw sound of a man who has just looked upon an abomination. It was a voice they would all remember in their nightmares for years to come. "Bones!" it echoed, the single word climbing the rock walls of the canyon, carrying with it the full weight of its awful meaning. Dear God in heaven, there are human bones. The word hit the cliff top like a physical blow. A wave of collective shock and horror washed over the crowd. A woman screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that was quickly stifled. Someone else let out a choked gasp. Men who had faced down blizzards and bandits took a half-step back from the edge, their faces pale beneath their sun-browned skin. Doc Holloway's face went slack, the clinical observer replaced by a man confronting the brutal finality of death. Boone felt the ground tilt beneath his feet. The world went fuzzy at the edges. He gripped Copper's neck, the mule's solid, trembling form the only thing keeping him upright. Her fear was no longer a mystery. It had a name now. It was the stench of death, so old and so profound that only an animal's pure instinct could sense it through layers of earth and time. The mystery of the bridge was over. The long, slow unfolding of its tragedy had just begun. The climb back up was a slow, arduous affair. When Marshal Wade's head and shoulders finally appeared over the precipice, he looked like a man who had aged a decade in an hour. His face was ashen, streaked with dirt and sweat, and his eyes, usually so sharp and perceptive, were haunted. He collapsed onto the solid ground, his chest heaving, his gaze fixed on some middle distance, seeing not the anxious faces of the townspeople, but the grim tableau he had left behind in the canyon's gut. Doc Holloway was at his side instantly, offering a canteen of water, his professional composure a thin veneer over his own shock. Wade drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin. "How bad is it?" Doc asked, his voice low and steady. Wade shook his head, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "It's bad, Doc. It's a whole family." The crowd, which had pressed in, fell silent, straining to hear his words. "The wagon must have gone clean through the railing. It's completely demolished. Looks like it happened years ago. The wood is punky, the iron is all rust. They were thrown clear. I found 3 of them." His voice cracked on the last word. "A man, a woman, and a child, a small one." A collective moan of anguish rose from the crowd. The horror, which had been a general shock at the discovery of bones, now became sharp, specific, and infinitely more painful. A family, a child. The abstract tragedy now had a shape, a form that every person there could understand in the most visceral way. The women clutched their own children tighter, their faces masks of pity and fear. The men looked down at their boots, at the horizon, anywhere but at each other, their own stoicism failing them in the face of such a pitiful end. For years, they had crossed that bridge, going about their lives, laughing, complaining, trading, while a family lay forgotten in the darkness below. The bridge's groans in the wind suddenly seemed less like the complaints of old timber and more like a lament that had gone unheard for far too long. "Who were they?" Martha Gable asked, her voice stripped of its usual gossipy curiosity, now just thin and trembling. "Did you find anything? A name?" Wade shook his head again. "Nothing. Whatever they had is long gone. Rotted away, washed away. They're just lost." The word hung in the air. Lost. It was a terrible finality. Lost to their families, lost to the world, and now almost lost to memory itself, unearthed only by the instinct of a terrified mule. The townspeople looked at each other, a silent, sickening realization dawning on their faces. They were the community these people had been trying to reach. This was their destination, and for years they had lain here just yards from safety, their hopes and dreams smashed to pieces at the bottom of the canyon. A sense of shared, retroactive guilt began to settle over them, thick and suffocating. It was in this moment of heavy, grief-stricken silence that a new figure emerged from the back of the crowd. He was an old man, stooped and frail, with a face like a weathered map of a long and difficult journey. Henrik Andersen, a Norwegian immigrant who had lived on a small hardscrabble homestead just outside of Redemption for as long as anyone could remember. He was a quiet man, kept to himself, his English thick with the accent of his homeland. He was a fixture in the town, but not quite a part of it, always on the periphery, his eyes holding a permanent, distant sorrow. He shuffled forward, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on Marshall Wade. In his hand, he held a piece of paper, folded and unfolded so many times that it looked as fragile as a dead leaf. It was yellowed with age and stained with what could have been water or tears or both. "Marshall," he said, his voice a dry, reedy whisper that commanded an immediate, absolute silence. Every eye turned to him. Wade looked up, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Henrik? What is it?" Henrik Andersen did not answer immediately. He took a few more shuffling steps until he stood in the center of the circle of townspeople. His hand trembled as he carefully, reverently unfolded the brittle paper. The crowd leaned in, mesmerized. The old man cleared his throat, a dry, rattling sound. "I have been waiting," he said, his voice gaining a strange, resonant strength. 5 years. I have been waiting." He looked from Wade to the faces in the crowd, and then his gaze drifted to the canyon's edge, as if he could see through the rock and dirt to the tragedy below. They were coming here. To me. A wave of confusion and dawning comprehension passed through the onlookers. "Who, Henrik?" Doc Holloway asked gently. "Who was coming?" Henrik looked down at the paper in his hand. It was a letter. He began to read, his voice wavering but clear, translating the hopeful, long-dead words into the funereal stillness of the afternoon. "My dearest Uncle Henrik," he began, and the breath caught in a dozen throats. "If you are reading this, it means our long journey is nearly at its end. The last reports we had in St. Joseph said the railroad now reaches to within a week's ride of your town of Redemption. The journey has been hard, harder than we could have imagined, but our spirits are high. Little Rose asks every day if we will see her great-uncle Henrik tomorrow." The old man's voice broke on the name. He paused, gathering himself, his knuckles white where he gripped the letter. The town was frozen, caught in the spell of his words. They were no longer bones. They were a man, a woman, and little Rose. "Mary sends her love," Henrik continued, his voice thick with unshed tears. "She has been a rock, a true pioneer woman. I think she is stronger than I am. She has packed seeds from her mother's garden in Ireland, says she will make a new garden bloom in the soil of Redemption. And me, I have bought the best steel plow I could find. I long for the feel of turning my own soil, of building a life beside you, not as a tenant, but as a free man on my own land. We have our savings, all that we have in the world, sewn into the lining of my coat. It is not much, but with hard work and God's grace, it will be enough. We hope to arrive within the month. Look for us by the first snows. Your loving nephew, Thomas Brennan." Henrik Andersen finished reading and slowly, carefully refolded the letter along its ancient creases. He looked up, and tears were now streaming freely down his deeply lined cheeks, carving paths through the dust of his own long wait. "Thomas," he whispered, the name a puff of air, a final exhalation of a hope he had carried like a hot coal in his heart for 5 long years. "My sister's boy, and his wife Mary, and their little girl, Rose." The dam of the town's composure broke. The formless grief became 1,000 sharp, specific sorrows. It was Thomas Brennan, the hopeful farmer. It was Mary, with her dreams of an Irish garden in the frontier dust. It was 4-year-old Rose who had asked every day if she was there yet. They weren't strangers. They were family. They were Henrik's family. and in that moment of shared, profound revelation, they became the town's family too. The unforgiving frontier, the slow decay of time, the treacherous, neglected bridge. These antagonists had claimed their victims. But now, in the hearts of the living, the confrontation with the past had come, and with it, the sacred duty to remember. The townsfolk looked at the grieving old man, then at the canyon that had become a tomb, and in their shared gaze was a new, unbreakable resolve. They would not leave the Brennans in the dark. They would bring them home. The 3 days that followed were a testament to the forging of a community. The raw, shocked grief of the discovery settled into a solemn, determined purpose. There was no formal vote, no debate. Marshal Wade simply looked at Olson, and Olson looked at the other men, and an unspoken covenant was made. The recovery of the Brennan family became an act of communal penance, a collective effort to right a wrong that had festered in the shadows for 5 long years. The work was brutal and reverent. The men of redemption, who lived by the strength of their backs and the skill of their hands, descended into the canyon each morning at dawn. Olson, the blacksmith, whose strength was a town legend, directed the rigging of a heavy-duty winch system, his commands echoing in the gorge, not as barks, but as respectful instructions. They cleared brush, moved rocks, and slowly, painstakingly, began to excavate the site. They worked in a focused, almost prayerful silence, the only sounds the scrape of shovels against rock, the groan of the winch, and the low murmur of men coordinating their efforts. Boone Delaney worked alongside them, his own guilt a private, sharp-edged stone in his gut. He, more than anyone, had felt the wrongness of the place, and yet he had cursed the mule that tried to warn him. Now his hands, accustomed to the lead ropes of his pack train, learned the unfamiliar weight of the shovel and the pickaxe, his sweat mingling with that of the farmers, the farriers, and the storekeeps. He was no longer just a man passing through. He was part of this town, bound to it by the shared, sacred task. Up on the cliff top, the women of redemption organized their own part of the vigil. They set up a station near the canyon's edge, keeping fires burning for warmth against the cool, high-country nights and for brewing endless pots of strong, black coffee. They brought hot food for the men, their presence a silent, steady source of support. Martha Gable, her sharp tongue silenced by the gravity of the work, coordinated the effort with a quiet efficiency no one knew she possessed. They mended the men's torn shirts, tended their blistered hands, and offered words of solace, their conversations low and somber. They were tending not just to the living, but to the memory of Mary Brennan, the woman who had dreamed of planting a garden among them. In their own way, they were planting one for her now, a garden of compassion and care on the barren edge of the chasm. Doc Holloway became the grim custodian of the dead. As the men below carefully unearthed the remains, they were wrapped in clean canvas and slowly, respectfully winched to the surface. Doc Holloway received them, his gentle hands doing the last work that could be done for the Brennan family. He worked in a makeshift tent set apart from the others, the grimness of his task isolating him, yet he was never truly alone. The town's respect and gratitude were a palpable presence around him. He identified the remains of Thomas, a tall man, as the letter had suggested. He found Mary, and among her bones, impossibly, a few small, petrified seeds clutched in the rotted remains of a linen pouch. And then came the smallest bundle, the one the men had unearthed with tears in their eyes, the one that made the entire town fall silent. Little Rose. Henrik Anderson was a constant, quiet presence throughout. He sat on a stool a short distance away, his ancient folded letter resting in his lap. He didn't speak much, but he watched the proceedings with an unblinking intensity. He was watching his family's long-delayed funeral procession. The townspeople gave him his space, but they were acutely aware of him. Their work was for him, a silent apology from a town that had not known he was waiting. On the 3rd day, they brought up the last of the wreckage, a single splintered wagon wheel. As it reached the cliff top, the sun glinting off its rusted iron rim, the work was done. The men, exhausted, grimy, and emotionally spent, climbed out of the canyon for the last time. They stood in a ragged line, looking at the 3 simple pine coffins that the town's carpenter had worked through the night to build. There was no sense of triumph, only a profound, aching sorrow and a quiet, hard-earned peace. They had done what was right. They had fulfilled their duty. The funeral was held the next morning. The entire town of Redemption gathered in the small cemetery behind the church. The sky was a high, clear blue, and a gentle wind whispered through the pines. The 3 coffins sat beside a single, wide grave. The preacher spoke of loss and of finding what was lost, of the duty of the living to honor the dead. But his words were secondary to the powerful, silent sermon of the town's presence. They stood not as strangers mourning an unknown family, but as a community burying its own. Henrik Anderson stood at the head of the grave, and beside him, Mary Brennan's petrified seeds lay in a small wooden box, ready to be buried with her. They would not grow into a garden, but they would be planted in the soil she had journeyed so far to reach. When the service was over, and the last shovel of earth had been placed on the grave, a strange sense of catharsis settled over the town. The air felt lighter. The shadow that had hung over the bridge seemed to have lifted. The people lingered, speaking in quiet tones, their faces sad but no longer haunted. They had faced the tragedy together, and in doing so, had transformed it into a shared, sacred memory that now belonged to the soul of the town itself. A few days later, his supplies loaded and his contract waiting, Boone Delaney led Copper back towards the crossing. He approached it with a quiet trepidation, his heart a tight knot in his chest. The town had already begun to repair the bridge, replacing the rotten planks and strengthening the rail that Thomas Brennan's wagon had smashed through. It looked stronger, safer. But it was the feel of the place that had changed. The malevolent presence was gone. The air was just air. The wind sighed through the canyon, not with sorrow, but with the neutral sound of moving air. Boone stopped Copper at the head of the bridge, just as he had a week before. He held the lead rope loosely, his own breathing shallow. He was prepared for another standoff, another fight. But Copper did not plant her feet. She did not pin her ears. She stood for a long moment, her head high, sniffing the wind. She looked across the bridge, then down into the canyon, and then back at the simple wooden cross that now marked the Brennan family's grave in the distant cemetery. A soft, low nicker rumbled in her chest. Not a sound of fear, but one of acknowledgement, of release. Her vigil, it seemed, was over. The souls she had sensed were at peace. The natural order, so violently disrupted, had been restored. Then, with a calm, deliberate step, she walked onto the bridge. Her hooves made a steady, solid sound on the new planks. Boone, a lump forming in his throat, walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on her neck. They crossed the expanse together, the chasm falling away beneath them. When they reached the other side, Boone stopped and looked back. He saw the town of Redemption, no longer just a collection of buildings and a stop on his route, but a place of substance, a community forged not in the easy times of prosperity, but in the crucible of shared grief and compassion. He looked at his mule, this stubborn, intuitive creature who had seen a truth no human could perceive, and felt a wave of gratitude and awe that went beyond simple ownership. The story of the Brennans was now woven into the fabric of redemption, a sad and beautiful thread. Their tragedy had consecrated the ground, and the town's response had consecrated its people. A hard-earned peace had settled over the canyon, and over the heart of the weathered mule skinner, who now understood that some bridges aren't just for crossing. Some are for remembering. He gave Copper's rope a gentle tug, and together they moved on, leaving the bridge standing not as a tomb, but as a memorial, a silent testament to the idea that trust, home, and love are not given, but are built, one splinter and one scar at a time.